Is there justice for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence? Now, when I was first asked to give this talk, the first name that popped into my head was of Nadia. I've known Nadia for over 6 years. She's a passionate young woman who is almost 16 years old. She's a painter, a student, and she has a love for life. However, when I first met Nadia back in the summer of 2012, Nadia was also a 10-year-old survivor of a horrific gang rape. At the time, Nadia's family was being pressurized by the attackers to enter into a compromise and recant their complaint. Eventually, the police got involved, as they often do in these matters, and the family and Nadia were forced to enter into compromise and withdraw their case. On the basis of that recanting, the trial court dismissed Nadia's case. Now, this is not an exception under Pakistan's criminal justice system, where an ordinary criminal case takes over 20 years to get resolved, and a criminal justice system where there is a lack of gender-sensitive safeguards, especially for survivors of GBV. However, Nadia's family was the exception, and they wanted more. They approached a group of lawyers, of which I was also a part of, and we filed a public interest litigation at Pakistan's Supreme Court. And on the basis of Nadia's story and her suffering, the Supreme Court of Pakistan ordered the trial courts that no more cases were to be dismissed on the basis of out-of-court settlements. It was also the first time in Pakistan's history that the Supreme Court ordered that for cases of rape, there would be gender-sensitive safeguards, which were to include anonymity of the victims, in-camera trials, and any other measures that were necessary to protect victims and survivors from pressure by the accused parties to recant their statement. Now, this is a great story, and I've used this story often, and those of you who know me would probably have heard this story before. And the fact of the matter, unfortunately, is that this is the only happy story that I have for all of you tonight. Unfortunately, under Pakistan's criminal justice system, the rate of convictions for violations of sexual and gender-based violence, that is, violations that are recognized under the law, is less than 4%. And most victims do not have the opportunity to complete a trial. Often, when, as my colleague Teresa pointed out, when victims present themselves before the formal criminal justice system, the first question that is raised, why you? And most victims of gender-based violence, as do most women, lead complicated lives. We make decisions and we make mistakes, but more often than not, the lives that we lead do not conform to society's standards of how a morally virtuous and sexually active woman should act, which is also the case for most of my clients. And as a result, for most of my clients, there has not been justice on account of their suffering, especially not for those who approach the formal criminal justice system. And in order to illustrate this point, I would like to take you back to 2011, when I had just graduated from law school and returned from the US back to Pakistan to practice in the criminal courts. That summer, I met this amazing woman named Farzana. She was 26 years old. She lived in a small village outside Lahore. Every day, Farzana would travel for 2 hours to go to Lahore, where she worked as a domestic servant. She was a vibrant woman, and as most vibrant and spontaneous women are, she was the center of gossip in her village, mostly because she liked to wear bright red lipstick, and the length of her shirts was often much shorter than those of her peers. On 11th July 2011, as Farzana was walking home after returning to work, she was attacked by 3 men. And that should have been the end of her story, as it often is for most survivors of rape in Pakistan. But Farzana defied odds, and the next morning, she woke up, she marched to the nearest police station, and she filed a complaint. The police officer who was on duty laughed at her in the face, and he said, "The fact that you have come to file this complaint shows to me that you are not a real victim, because no true survivor of rape would have the guts to come, and nobody would advertise their shame in this way. She was taken to the hospital for a medical examination, as is required under the law. The forensic expert inserted 2 fingers into her vagina, and on that basis, he recorded on the medical legal certificate that victim is habituated to sexual intercourse. It was not until 2016 that Pakistan would formally recognize DNA evidence as admissible evidence. And until then, and still now, the primary forensic medical expert evidence involves the 2-finger rape test, which Pakistan inherited from the British Empire, which involves diagnosing a person's sexual history on the basis of the size of their vagina. Now, by the time Farzana's case reached me, a very inexperienced and unqualified lawyer at that point, she had already been refused by 7 lawyers on the basis that they termed her case hopeless and advised her to take whatever money that she could get from her attackers. And that's how she landed on my office. Farzana and I would walk to court by ourselves. The courtroom that the trial was taking place in was the size of this room, and it was filled with over twice as many people. And by people, I mean male lawyers, male police officers, and male accused. They would all gather around the courtroom waiting for their case to be called. Farzana and I, being the only women in the courtroom, we would stand in the corner and we would huddle and try to hide from everybody until our case was called. And when our case was called, we would have to push and shove to make our ways to the podium. And nothing is as exciting in a criminal court in Pakistan as a rape case. For 10 months, every week, Farzana and I would show up in court. Farzana had to recount what had happened to her over and over and over again in the presence of hundreds and hundreds of male people. And now the accused parties realized what a great advantage they had on account of it being a discriminatory legal system. And they actually started arranging for the whole village to attend the hearings in the hopes that it would eventually break Farzana. But it did not, and we kept coming again and again. However, on the last day of the hearing, the judge turned to me and he said, "How do you dispute this scientific evidence which shows that this woman is sexually active and you clearly cannot rely on her testimony?" And I turned to the judge and said a line that I had been practicing over and over again in front of my colleagues, in front of my friends, and I said, "Your Honor, a woman's vagina does not determine her sexual history, and her sexual history does not determine whether or not the rape happened." And in that moment, the whole courtroom went silent. Nobody could believe that a woman, and that to a young woman, had uttered the words vagina in front of a full courtroom. But the faces of the lawyers and the judges, I knew in my heart that we had lost. And the order came out next month. It was in English, and I was given the task of translating it to Farzana. And I read it out to her line by line. But the operative part was, the woman appears to be a woman of loose moral character who is habituated in sexual intercourse. Therefore, we cannot accept her testimony of the offense. As I read the order out to her, Farzana turned to me and she said, "Settle hi kar lete," which means we should have just settled in the first place. And the next day, Farzana left her village, and I have not heard from her since. Unfortunately, Farzana's story is the story of most survivors of sexual and gender-based violence who turn to the criminal justice system in the hopes of justice. However, because I do not want to end on such a depressing note, Pakistan may be the country that let down Farzana and Nadia, but it is also the country of the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner, Malala Yousafzai. It is also the country of 2-time Oscar winner and human rights activist Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy. The women's movement in Pakistan is one of the most active women's movements in the world. In 2016, Pakistan passed a law where once and for all, a woman's character was not admissible in any kind of crime of sexual and gender-based violence. In 2016, Pakistan also passed a law where DNA evidence was recognized as admissible evidence. And yesterday, I received a call from one of my friends who works at the Punjab Commission on the Status of Women, which is Pakistan's national human rights institution for women. And she told me that one of the recommendations that the new government has picked up for legislative reforms involves banning the two-finger test, finally. And this is why we continue to do the work that we do. Thank you very much.